I'm Karen Johanne, and I'm an associate professor at the Danish Center for Mindfulness. And I almost had a heart attack. It's not just something I fantasized about because my computer broke down completely. And Friday they still couldn't gain access to my backups. And here I am with my notebook. So I'm gonna try to make a presentation just telling you about this topic of mine, which is stress. So my background is I'm a neurobiologist, and I have a PhD in medicine. And I studied neuroscience. Is that better? I was in brain science for 10 years, and my main interest during that time was context dependency in a wide sense. When I started in neuroscience around 2000, it was just a big issue why we couldn't reproduce any neuroscientific results. So the beautiful images we saw on brain scanning results, when people tried to reproduce them, it was always difficult. And researchers started wondering, what is all this about? So I started being interested in maybe it's the context dependence, maybe it's the individual differences, maybe it's the experiences you come to the brain scanner with. Also, there was something in neuroscience, when you put people into the brain scanner and you ask them to you needed something to compare with. If you wanted to study, say, doing some math, and you would then put them in the scanner, do this mathematical calculation, and then we need to compare to a kind of a baseline. You would ask people to, and now, just lie still and do nothing. Think about nothing. Don't think about anything at all. And then they looked at the brain scans, and it looked sometimes pretty much the same, like when you're doing the mathematical calculation, because you're always thinking about something. So I was interested in that, and I was interested in how different processes in the brain interact, like when you feel emotional about something, why can't you think very clearly about this topic? Or when you ask people to do like a memory task in the scanner, if they feel emotional, if they are emotionally affected by the stimuli, I used music as stimuli for many years, then they could not do the task. They would be distracted by it, or they would listen to the music. So it was very easy to see that when you didn't do a task and just listen passively and experience the world, which was then listening to music, you would have large emotional activations. When I asked the participants to memorize the sounds, for example, you would see the emotional activations going down significantly. So I thought that was interesting, and that's when you all know something about mindfulness here, we heard before. You know that this has great relevance to mindfulness and how that works in the brain to change your perspective on things. So I think that understanding the biological framework that stress arises from is absolutely fundamental to understand also how can we most effectively reduce stress. So about 5 years ago I started being interested in stress research, reading about that, not just the brain, but what happens in the body and what are the links between feeling stressed and becoming ill. And we really need to understand these processes in much more detail to be able to address them in stress reduction techniques. So, we all know stress is a big problem. We know that the onset of stress-related illnesses become early all the time. Still, most people in Denmark, they don't know what stress really is when you ask them. It can be something psychological. People often perceive of stress as being something psychological, although you feel it in your entire body. The effects are all over the place. So I think it's surprising that stress is not on the curriculum in primary schools, for example. Why don't we learn a lot more about stress from an early age? So, and unfortunately in Denmark there's also currently an issue about talking about stress as being an individual issue. Like, we want to address it more like the individual should not take responsibility for these processes because it's stigmatizing, and you put attention on these people who suffer from stress. So couldn't we just change something about the surrounding world instead of going and ask people to work with their stress and get to know their body, because it's so unpleasant and it's too difficult? Isn't there a pill we could take, or some other more interventions on the organizational level in workplaces, for example, so we don't need to get to all this hard work? But it takes a lot of time to become really stressed and become really ill, and it also takes a lot of time to try to rewind it, or to learn methods to become able to deal with your stress. So what everybody really needs to know, I think, is that the stress response is triggered by fear. The stress response is triggered by all types of fear. We have a lot of different words: being anxious, being insecure, inappropriate, nervous, afraid. But really, this is all these types of feelings that trigger the stress response. When the brain reaches this level of stress that we call the threshold, then starts all these processes in the brain. We call it stress response. And that is actually a series of very hardwired psychological processes. Once they get going, they get going. We can maybe not do so much about that, of modulating that, but what we can do something about is working with the level of fear in the brain. Becoming familiar with our fear. What does it do? Could we change something about the way we experience the world? And this is what mindfulness does, of course. So if we look a bit deeper into the nervous system, what is really going on below this fear? What is the nervous system doing? The nervous system basically reacts to unpredictability. If you ask evolutionary biologists, what they will tell you is that the nervous system as such developed to detect unpredictability, and so that the organism could survive and become able to react in the most optimal manner in the world. So unpredictability of all sorts triggers fear or anxiety, being nervous, all these words we have, then the stress gets going. So the central problem is that we cannot avoid unpredictability in our world. And the modern society is packed with unpredictability. So we need to become able to exist and live our life with this huge level of unpredictability, this huge amount of information that we will never be able to gain control over. Never, ever, how much we try. So we need to be able to live with that. So it does not trigger fear. So my mission is to understand the psychophysiological mechanisms that turn stress up and down, or rather that turn anxiety up and down, increase and decrease anxiety and fear. And neuroscience has contributed a lot already to this evidence. We know the areas in the brain that are involved in the stress response, areas that was a mystery only 10 years ago. We have quite a great and advanced understanding today, so it becomes more and more concrete. For example, it's been a great mystery: if you suffer from long-term stress, how do you get inflammation all over the body? Because cortisol, like the primary stress hormone, you know that dampens inflammation, right? When you suffer from long-term stress, you have a lot of cortisol in the blood. So how come you get inflammatory conditions all over the body? It's been a huge mystery or a paradox, and if you read the literature, you'll see that it just avoids this. There's something here that doesn't really fit, we can't explain it. But I think 5-6 years ago, there was this article coming out showing that what really happens, and it happens in every tissue that has been examined so far, is that when you have cortisol roaming the bloodstream for extended periods of time, the cells stop responding to cortisol. They simply become immune. They become resistant. So what happens then in the body is that it's like a free space for inflammatory processes to start. And inflammation is a central process in all kinds of diseases, in early stages of diseases. So finally there you have a link between long-term stress and all these different very serious diseases that in the early stages all have some type of inflammation. Today you even study depression as an inflammatory disease, where you have looked at neurotransmitter systems in the brain. For many years you start looking at inflammation as well. So neuroinflammation it's called. We also know that in the hippocampus, the memory structure in the brain, it starts neurogenesis, it's called, the formation of new cells that normally happens all through your life into your 90s. When cortisol are in the blood for high levels for a long time, it has this toxic effect so that the new cells cannot become formed anymore. And you can see that in brain scans, actually, that the hippocampus, this memory center in the brain, starts shrinking. So you can see that in different types of stress-related diseases. So it's not the cortisol in itself that's toxic, it's the related processes of glutamate high levels and calcium high levels that are involved in forming memories. So you create a toxic environment to your cells in the brain. So we know a lot about that. And from the other angle, studying mindfulness, the effects of mindfulness with the neuroscience methods, of course you go and look at these things. Is it reversed or is it, and actually there is mounting evidence that indicates that these processes are reversed, like the hippocampus will be bigger and in a better shape in old people. This was one of the first studies by Halsell and Sarah Lazar. Those people it's more than 10 years ago now, showing that the hippocampus would be larger in elderly people who had meditated for many years than in people who had not meditated. Also, there is evidence indicating that the hippocampus will start growing again after an MBSR course. There's evidence indicating that the amygdala, I think you all heard about the amygdala, the alarm central, which is in the tip of the temporal lobes, will start shrinking. There are studies showing that after the MBSR program. And there are studies showing that the amygdala become less reactive to stressful stimuli. So when you change your perception of the world, the way you experience things, their alarm value like decreases. And you can see that in the brain. You can see that on brain scans. So the brain is continuously being programmed and reprogrammed, and mindfulness can help you do that. And I think that's one of the most interesting neuroscientific paradigms, and one that we are going to use now is actually looking at this basic way that, like when you are awake, about half the time, you are not really present in the now. You're not really here with your attention. You're thinking about something in the future, planning, or you're thinking about something you could have maybe done a little bit differently in the past. It's a lot of your awake hours where the brain is just like mind wandering. You're thinking about all kinds of things, but as it turns out, it's not. It's kind of an individual, and you can describe it. And questionnaires have been developed to look into this. So-called resting state questionnaires, like being awake, not being occupied with some task, just thinking about whatever, not thinking about nothing. We know we don't do that, but you fill in a questionnaire, and I would have liked to show you that. It's very simple. It's 30 items, and it has been like boiled down by a huge statistical work going on for 13 years in Amsterdam, based on all kinds of questionnaires from psychiatry and psychology that describes what's going on in your mind. What are you feeling? If you close your eyes for 3 minutes, what's going on? And they can use this questionnaire where you kind of tick off, like it's like items, 30 items, and it could be like, I felt happy, I felt relaxed, I felt pain, and then you will like tick off, not at all or very much. You go on living your life. You come back to the lab like up to 3 years later. You fill in the questionnaire again, and it looks pretty much the same. So like if you're the type of person who is planning, thinking, your mind is in the future all the time, when you come back 3 years later, it will still be like, it will still be you. It will describe what's going on in your mind when you close your eyes for 3 minutes. So in combination with development of neuroimaging methods that are used to study what's going on in the brain then, and does it make sense? Can we relate this change in the way of perceiving the world that we know now relates to practicing mindfulness for an extended period of time? You know that you start perceiving differently. Will that reflect in what's going on in your mind when you close your eyes for 3 minutes? And we tried it on a group of veterans. We tried it on special care workers, special pedagogues in Danish. And we found these really interesting reflections in that it actually does change in your well-being, there's one dimension called discontinuity of mind, tankemøller in Danish, which also goes down significantly. You pay less attention to feelings of pain in the body. You become more extrovert. So it's what you would expect, really, and it's really interesting to see how that reflects in kind of your basic mental state, the way you perceive the world. That's what is really interesting, I think. So we are going to do that now, use this method. We got some funding from Vellevforeningen to study 192 elderly people who are still working in the private sector between 60 and 65 years of age, and they are going to get the MBSR program. And we are going to look at the resting state in the brain. What does it look like? How does it correlate with the thoughts and feelings you have? We are also going to use other measures, psychophysiological measures of heart rate variability, because we know that, I don't have time to go into the biology of the stress response, but we know that it triggers a change in balance in the two branches of the autonomic nervous system. You have more sympathetic activity and less parasympathetic activity. You can measure that by measuring on the heart rate, because it's innervated by the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to do that. We're going to use questionnaires, and we're going to look at brain plasticity also by looking at the sizes of the amygdala, of the hippocampus, also of areas in the prefrontal cortex, to see, do we have this? Because most neuroimaging studies are done in younger populations. Do we still see this brain plasticity in normal, healthy, 60, 65-year-old employees? My colleague, Niels Viggo Hansen, who is working with me on this project, will be here tomorrow and tell you about that, Eric, and discuss the details. And what else did I want to say? Did I spend my time? It's been quite stressful for me, this not having all my beautiful brain pictures to show to you. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. We're going to look at microstructural changes in the brain. Usually you look at macrostructural changes, you can see it on the brain images. We're going to look also at methods that go into the individual structures and look at smaller changes in density. So it's very exciting to have gotten funding to do this kind of a study in a study group that have not been studied very much, this age group. And we become more and more older people in Denmark, so it's also of course of great importance and interest to the society if we can keep people mentally healthy for more years, and they can contribute and thrive. I think that's what I was ended up saying.